Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. From time to time, all of us are called upon to negotiate an uncomfortable situation. Perhaps we'll have a dispute with a coworker, or a loved one, or a car salesman. Conflict can bring out the worst in us, and it can be a challenge to keep our cool when the stakes are high. Let's take a look at the components of a successful negotiation, taken from Fisher and Urey's Getting to Yes. According to them, any method of negotiation may be fairly judged by 3 criteria. It should produce a wise agreement, if the agreement is possible. It should be efficient, and it should improve or at least not damage the relationship between the parties. Now, we are fortunate to be joined tonight by attorney and mediator John Butler to help us plan negotiation strategy to make us more effective. Welcome. I want to thank you for making the time to come on Bay Area Psychology tonight.
Well,
talk about mediation. I confess that part of my interest in this was spurred by a show we did recently on collaborative divorce, and I just thought that was such an interesting idea of using mediation and having all the parties in the same room, being able to talk together instead of having to do sort of like the classic child's game of telephone, which is my lawyer says to your lawyer who says, you know,
right.
That sort of thing.
Yeah.
So what got you interested in doing mediation?
Well, I was a litigator and very aggressive, forceful, successful litigator. And one day I was in a parking lot and it came to me that I was a peacemaker rather than a litigator, and that I was a mediator. And so I began developing, the training and skills to begin to do what really my heart calls to do, which is mediate.
Okay, so you got tired of the battle that litigation requires?
I still like to litigate. I'm not completely evolved to the point where I'm a pure peacemaker.
Okay.
And it's very soul satisfying. And as I get better at the art of mediation, it's more fun and it's easier.
Okay. So when people come to see you, do they come with the intention of mediation, or do they sometimes come to see you for traditional legal reasons and then you educate them about mediation?
I have a separate business from my law practice called Harmony with Integrity, which is a mediation practice. And people that contact me in that venue are contacting an experienced, aware mediator.
Okay.
And their interest is to develop a mediation of a dispute.
Okay.
Occasionally I'll have a client come in that wants to, mostly in divorce type cases, where they don't have any concept of mediation, and I will bring up early on their options in terms of what my preference in terms of how to style the result that they want.
Okay. All right, and so then they're aware and can make a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you, let's take a look, actually, at the first of our graphics we prepared, because
Okay.
Urey and Fisher really did a good job, I think, in their book Getting to Yes, to sort of begin to talk about how to do this. The first thing they talk about in any successful mediation is being able to separate the people from the problem, which means dealing with our perceptions, putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, giving the other person a stake in the outcome by making sure they participate in the process, acknowledging their emotions, and communicating accurately and with a purpose. And I have all of those in front of me, so we can refer to them.
Okay.
But in terms of separating the people from the problem, I mean, that seems to me that that's probably a pretty basic place to start. I mean,
The art of a mediator is to be neutral and at the same time be empathetic with both parties. So if you can imagine, the individual parties are very entrenched in the rightness of their position. They're not willing to move off of that unless they empathetically feel, not believe, but feel that I have understood them and I appreciate their concerns. Okay. And the delicate part of that is I have to be able to do that with both sides. And then there's a shift that goes on that they think this person is a neutral, fair-minded person, I trust him. If I align myself with one side only, then nothing happens. From that point forward, the mediation would just be essentially a hard bargaining settlement type of conference where a judge will pound on one side and pound on the other side.
okay.
So it's a very subtle but very interesting thing. I have to empathize and connect and stay neutral at the same time.
Well, actually, it reminds me of what I do for a living as a therapist when a couple comes in, which is the idea in couples counseling is you want to make sure both people feel heard. And you're right, that is a bit of a challenge. In terms of separating the person from the problem, I mean, you probably encounter people, like you say, who are pretty stuck in their positions. And I would guess initially maybe pretty blaming in the way they address each other, particularly if it's a divorce situation.
Well, typically very righteous.
Righteous, okay.
Depending on what the circumstances are, blaming. You know, you have a dog barking case where a neighbor's dog is barking, the one is very righteous and the other is very blaming.
Okay.
You know, it's not always a situation where both sides are blaming the other person, like you have in a divorce or a family situation where the blame cycle just goes around and around. Sometimes it's very polarized. You have very self-righteous on one side and very blaming on the other.
Mm-hmm. So part of dealing with or getting them to have I mean, do they need to have an emotional reaction to each other for mediation to be helpful? I mean, because they talk about, Yuri talks about having an emotional understanding of the other person.
My experience as a mediator is that the parties go through a psychological shift before they can settle. And I think that would be called an emotional reaction. I would never use it in that terms.
Okay.
My experience is the conflict basically gets heated up to the point where, frankly, I think this is never going to settle. This is it. I want out of here. This is insane. What am I doing? This is a disaster. And at that moment, something shifts inside of them, and there's just a sense of peace. And it's essentially a spiritual experience, frankly. That's how I would denominate it.
Okay. So something, so there isn't a particular technique in mediation that creates that happening. It sounds like it's something that is sort of something that gets exchanged between the two parties involved.
The mediator is an artist, and there's a basic palette of what you can use and what works and what doesn't work. Reflective listening is very effective. And the other things that they suggest in the book that we're going to come to later. All of those are essentially tools, but they're not applied mechanically. They're applied situationally, and they're applied in some kind of ethos that makes a difference in the process. And I never know when it's going to happen. I've had times with people just coming in the door, they kind of get off it. I mean, the whole psyche process came to getting mediation, and it's just they decided to get willing to sit down and negotiate the settlement.
Okay, so so by the time they've made the decision to come see you, they've already made some of that movement you're talking about?
Sometimes, yeah. It's very surprising.
Now, when they talk about communicating with a purpose, part of what my understanding of that is that to not get in that cycle of sort of repeating the same argument you've had 100,000 times before.
The reason people repeat the same argument 100 times before is because they don't feel heard and understood. So my job is to break that cycle by listening with incredible intentionality, hearing at a deepest level I can comprehend what they're trying to say and what's underlying it. And I will ask probing questions or inviting questions to get to that, and then reflecting it back to them so that they know that they have been heard. In doing that, of course, the other person hears the scenario at least twice and sometimes 3 times, maybe even 4 times, and they get a much better sense of what the other person's issues are. On an emotional level, the person who did the speaking feels heard because I've heard them, not necessarily because the other party's heard them. So it's a fascinating kind of card play, but emotionally they feel heard. And once they feel heard, sometimes I'll reflect back and I'll be off one little nuance and they'll correct that and I'll say it and they'll smile and say, "You got it." And that's that.
Okay, so they basically just need to have somebody recognize their point of view and treat it with respect and with validity. Okay, let's take a look at the next part of the palette you described, okay? In terms of focusing on interests and not positions. Explore compatible and conflicting interests, ask why and why not, acknowledge base needs like security and recognition, and avoid having a bottom line. Stay flexible. Okay, so in terms of looking at our interests, Fisher and Yuri talk a lot about recognizing that there's probably a lot of different interests we all have for the same situation. There's probably a lot of different levels coming to play. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, and the deeper one can go, the easier it is to find commonality and appreciation.
Can you give me an example of that? That's interesting.
Well, for example, I do a lot of mediations for juvenile delinquents who have been convicted of a crime, and they're obligated to pay restitution, and the victims come in and basically confront them.
Oh, my goodness.
So on one superficial level, they need to determine how much money to pay back. And if I focus on that, it essentially gets into hard bargaining and nothing really happens. But when we talk about the bigger social picture of what a difference it's going to make in this young person's life and how it affected this the victim, and vice versa, when the offender has a chance to speak about how their life has been impacted by this, we're operating at a much deeper issue of the big picture here. And there's a lot of commonality there. The youngster wants to get a head start in life and do better, and so the victim wants that person to have a head start and do better. I mean, it's an amazing thing. So by the time we get to the money issues, it's almost a done deal in my mediations around on that subject.
That's interesting. Do you ever have the experience where somebody's intractable? I mean, this is their interest. But I was thinking particularly a victim who says, you know, I'm interested in getting revenge as opposed to...
The people who I've seen are intractable are more what you'd call the perpetrator, who are used to the opposite of mediation, which is hard bargaining, mercenary scorched earth tactics, my way or nothing, and essentially absolutely inflexible. And that kind of intractable thing, very much a perpetrator energy. Judgmental of the other person's ethics and honor, critical of every fact that they present, and essentially totally unwilling to participate. The only time those get into mediation is when they're usually court-ordered or when they're trying to con the other person. They're not good candidates for most mediations.
Okay. Now, if that's happening and you realize that this person has a conning agenda, do you just call a halt to it and say, I'm not going to do this?
No, I'll name it.
Oh, okay.
I will name it. And I will say, in a neutral way, I would hope that the other person would mention it first, but sometimes they're not in that position. I'll say, it seems to me like this is going on, or it seems to me that there's something out of balance here.
Okay.
And then I'll begin to probe that. And occasionally they'll get off of it, and they'll know that they've been busted, and they realize that that's their tactic, and that's their normal style of, you know, salesmanship or whatever.
Right.
And then they get off it and go on. I've had one case where even the man's attorney felt like his client was out of line, and you could just see it. Everyone in the room realized that this guy was just absolutely out of line. And the mediation ended, and that was that.
Okay.
And there's a sense of that. And I almost always feel like it's going to break down before it settles. I mean, the point is that the people are intractable until they're not. And so I don't give up too early. It's not like I feel like, well, this is a waste of time and I'm going to leave.
Okay.
It takes my commitment to the process in order for them to get through that.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back. Stay with us. When we return, we'll continue to explore successful negotiation and mediation strategy.